welcome back everyone. My name is Alexis Sana. I'm the founder and facilitator at Human Leaders. And today we are diving into part 2 of our burnout series, presenting the Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021. And we are joined today by Sally Clarke, who is the co-author and co-researcher of this body of work. Last week, Sally took us through what exactly burnout is, and it was a very illuminating session as we took time to dive a little deeper into burnout, the dimensions of burnout, what causes burnout, and how at an organizational level we can start to do something about it. So in today's session, we're going to take that one step further. We're going to be really looking with depth into the causes of burnout, and then also diving into some of the preventative strategies that we should be using at an organizational level. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Sally to the session today to get us started. And again, at the end of the session, hang around, pop your questions into the chat, and we will get some live dialogue going around this. And hopefully Sally and I can answer any questions that you might have. So welcome back, Sally, for session 2.
Thank you so much, Alexis. It's great to be back. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to, last week I've sort of talked about what burnout looks like, and hopefully we've been able to get a sort of a visceral sense of what that looks and feels like. And this week, delving into the causes of burnout and hopefully shattering some myths. And I think what's also sort of important to know up front is that I do not have all of the answers, nor do I have a simple quick fix for burnout. Like many of the issues that we face, it's complex, and it's going to take some motivated involvement from leaders to address it. Great. So today we're going to delve into causes and solutions in terms of burnout. I'm going to walk through a quick recap of what burnout is, which we looked at in depth last week, and I would encourage you, if you didn't join or you haven't had a chance to watch the video, to go back and revisit it, because it does give I think a really clear picture of what burnout looks like. It's a term that we use a lot, so I think it's really important for us to understand in clear language what it actually really is in practice. Then we're going to shift to sort of what causes burnout, what the underlying causes are. Co-researcher Dr. John Chan and I identified 5 team and 5 organisational factors that go towards burnout. So we're going to look at those each briefly shortly. Then we're going to take a quick look at what actually stops leaders from taking action, because there is an increasing body of data. We see it a lot, even in mainstream media these days, about how prevalent burnout is and the impact it has at an individual, but also an organisational level. So what's stopping leaders perhaps from taking action to end burnout? Then I'm going to shift to a framework that Dr. Chan and I developed based on our own research, other research that we've looked at, as well as the data from the study, as a kind of framework that leaders can use. It's a framework that sort of, I think, gives a sort of a macro level approach to ending burnout that's really empowering, and I think something that certainly will hopefully resonate with human leaders, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about it. Finishing with plenty of time for questions and hopefully some answers. So before we delve in, last week I shared an embarrassing photo of myself. This one is another one. This one last week was one before I burnt out, and this is a photo of me on a Greek island, mid-2010, deep in burnout. And when I look at this photo, I see an empty shell of myself. I had been working as a finance lawyer at a very prestigious European firm, and had sort of hit a fairly deep point in my burnout, and took some time off. I felt really hollow and empty at this point, and it took months after this photo was taken for me to start feeling like I was finding myself again. And at the time, I was really reluctant to use the term burnout, as it felt like it signified failure on my part. And this is one of the tricky things about burnout, because we have this persisting mistaken idea that it results from our own personal lacking or failure. We keep pushing and trying and desperately willing things to be okay. I didn't know then that burnout is not the individual's fault. So let's look at what the real causes of burnout are. But first, let's take a quick look again at the definition of burnout. So as we looked at last week, in 2019, the World Health Organization for the first time defined burnout. And this is a slightly abbreviated version of their definition. So burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress with 3 dimensions: exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced efficacy. So we walked through these in quite some depth last week. These are the dimensions that we use to measure burnout. So some metrics that we see about burnout at the moment are usually self-reporting or just on the exhaustion dimension. But we actually see with burnout, firstly, those really drastic feelings of depletion, incredibly high levels of weariness, but at the same time, sort of an incapacity to find rest. So you're really struggling with sleep and feeling always, way behind in terms of the rest balance. The second dimension is cynicism. So this tends to be a kind of withdrawal, negativity, alienation, and it can be about your job, and it can ultimately also permeate to feeling negative about yourself and even the world at large. And that can manifest also in some sort of social isolation, withdrawing from relationships. And then the third dimension is reduced efficacy. And this occurs because burnout compromises your executive and your cognitive function, which means you can basically do less. You might start making mistakes, and particularly if your identity is very attached to your intellectual capacities, as it is for a lot of high achievers, when this dimension starts to manifest, it can be quite scary. It can trigger fear and even panic. And it can cause us to sort of, rather than acknowledging that something is wrong, enter into a state of denial. So facing the truth of burnout as for the individual can be very scary, particularly as there is a persisting stigma around it. As I described also last week, so the combination of these dimensions can give rise to a kind of existential questioning. You might find you don't recognize yourself anymore. You do things you wouldn't normally do. A couple of ways that I've heard it described, it empties you from within. And one of the leading researchers actually says burnout is an erosion of the human soul. So it's a really debilitating experience. So the big question, what causes burnout? So as I mentioned, burnout is not the individual's fault. Burnout, as the World Health Organization pointed out, is caused by chronic workplace stress. The causes of chronic workplace stress are unhealthy work cultures. So when we work in unhealthy systems and use bad processes and have or are exposed to toxic behaviours for an ongoing period, then chronic stress is often not far behind. So based on existing research, as I mentioned, our own research and the data we derived in our study, Dr. Chan and I identified 5 team and 5 organisational factors that I'll walk us through shortly. I also do want to highlight that there is a broader cultural issue. So it's organisational, but there's also a kind of a work culture that permeates our society. And this is one where we glorify hard work, we glorify sacrifice in the name of success. We venerate overwork. So there's these kind of beliefs and thoughts that we have about work that also, I think, contribute to that that tendency that we might have to think that overwork is a good thing and for it to become normalized. And it's something that I think it's really on us as leaders to lead the change. And New Zealand researcher, Dr. Susie McAlpin, I think has a really great metaphor for it. The way she describes it is, if you have a lake full of sick fish, you don't just go and treat every individual sick fish. You look at the water quality. You measure what's going on. You make changes to create a healthy environment for the fish to thrive. And the same goes for burnout. We need to look at the water quality in our organisations, and I think even in society more broadly. So let's look at the 5 team factors. just slow me down if I'm going too fast. I feel like I have a lot of things to say about these causes, and I'd like to give you as much information as possible on each of them. So the 5 team factors, the first is the lack of manager support. So managers are on the front line of burnout, and they can be central to preventing burnout, or they can actually drive the problem. A consistently bad manager can leave people feeling isolated, exploited, and stuck in survival mode, which is kind of what we can feel like in burnout because of that chronic stress. The nervous system reaction means that we're in this heightened state of awareness, just trying to survive. A supportive manager actively manages workload, pushes back to stakeholders, listens and encourages people to take care of themselves and set boundaries. And can actually, I think we need to be mindful of the fact that can be undermined by poor senior leadership behaviours and decisions. You can have a manager doing their utmost best to look after their team and really prevent burnout. But if there are then senior leadership decisions, for example, to make massive regular redundancies, which sort of create a real sense of unsafety, that can really mess with that trust and respect that the manager has worked so hard to build. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Unreasonable time pressure. So short bursts of sort of manageable time constraint can be healthy and productive, but when deadlines are unreasonable and pressure is excessive, this can create a pressure cooker situation that fosters burnout. You'll see that high-performing individuals can often appear to sort of sustain this for a longer period, but when it goes on for long enough at that level, pretty much anyone will burn out under those conditions. So leaders need to stay super clear about their team's capacity and ensure that people have adequate opportunity to rest and recuperate. And I'm not just talking about weekends or vacations here. I'm talking about in the workplace, that your tasks are balanced. So there are the more intensive tasks that you might do, but there's also other tasks that allow you time to just allow your brain to do something else, maybe something more social, and to keep that variety going so that we're having that balance found in the workplace rather than relying on weekends or vacations for rest. An unmanageable workload is probably one of the most central causes of burnout, and having too much to do can take many forms. For one, it might be long hours, for another, endless administrative tasks, and for another, a lack of guidance on a complex or unfamiliar task. The number of hours people work each week does contribute to burnout. So we see a much higher rate above 50 hours, and that really escalates above 60 hours per week. When work feels burdensome and endless, even high-performing people can really shift from engaged to hopeless as they shift deeper along the burnout spectrum. Unclear and inconsistent communications from managers can be a real issue as well. So when expectations and accountability are inconsistent or unclear, it can become really frustrating and really quite exhausting even to just work out what is expected of you. While micromanaging is harmful, so too is not having enough guidance, not having enough support in what you're doing, and having a clear framework for how you're doing it. Unfair and inequitable treatment is another major cause of burnout, and this can be demonstrated in different and often quite subtle ways. Microaggressions, it can involve bias, favoritism, mistreatment, and it can run as far as verging on abuse. The healthy work environment really hinges on trust and psychological safety. So when people are respected and treated fairly, they're more resilient, form stronger relationships. And so when people don't trust their manager or their teammates, that bond of trust breaks, and burnout can really take root in those situations. And anecdotally, I work with quite a lot of, in my coaching practice, with people who are in burnout who have been affected by that particular factor. So let's shift now to the more organisational factors that can contribute to burnout. Probably for me, most prominent is poor senior leader role modelling. Senior leaders have the most influence over how an organisation operates and the environment that it creates. So they really need to take the lead in creating a culture of well-being and transparency by modelling this behaviour. So this means having healthy behaviours and boundaries themselves, talking about burnout and the dangers that it can involve, providing visible support and frameworks for change. Senior leaders and stakeholders have to make well-being a strategic imperative. When employees don't hear from senior leaders, or if they see them saying one thing and doing another, and this actually happens annoyingly often, they often, they'll lose sort of faith in any kind of wellbeing initiative, and they'll think it's probably just another sort of PR stunt by senior leaders. Lack of support structures and guidelines is another big factor. So while burnout is not something that can be solved by one leader or manager or HR department alone, we need to see that the causes are really structural and cultural, and they run really deep. So leaders need to be creating initiatives that investigate and reframe these structures, such as job design, so that these are then embedded with well-being. So for example, making sure that workload is manageable, expectations are realistic, and rest guidelines, which I spoke to just before, are implemented to prevent chronic stress from arising. And it's one of those annoying things, like many things in life, where it's not fixed. You don't just put a framework in place and it sets sail and you're good. It requires ongoing monitoring, communication, and that space of psychological safety, so there is a place for people to be able to provide feedback, create new iterations, and continuously working to make sure that it's an ongoing, it really matches the needs as an organisation changes. Structural under-resourcing. So do more with less is a common corporate mantra. It actually often seeds burnout. So when downsizing and consolidation are the norm, which we see during economic crises as we have recently, these budget cuts can actually lead to a worse situation in the longer term because of under-resourcing. So give the example that, say three jobs are consolidated into two, and the additional workload causes one of those people to start to burn out, and they're experiencing chronic stress and starting to show the symptoms of burning out. As burnout develops, their efficacy is reduced, they start making mistakes, they start not being able to work nearly as efficiently or deliver the quality that they once were, to the point where the department misses multiple targets. So when we ensure job role design is specific and realistic and sustainable, and we allocate resources accordingly, we can actually ensure lower costs over the longer term and higher productivity and quality of work over the longer term. So it does require that little bit of being able to zoom out and see the bigger picture. Adherence to outdated modes of working is another big one. So whenever I hear, that's how we've always done it, it tends to be, for me, that's a signal that there's some kind of clinging on to a practice that is actually outdated. So things like endless meetings that are unnecessary, excessive administrative work, the client is always right, hierarchical approval processes, and the normalization of working weekends or being available on vacation. These are all structures where burnout thrives. And there's often these modes of work are so ingrained, they go unquestioned. I know for me at the law firm where I worked, there were a lot of these kind of behaviours that were it's just how it's done. And it's certainly what the partners that I had worked for had experienced, and therefore it went unquestioned. So when we evaluate and shift these processes, especially turning attention to those that are normalised or otherwise taken for granted, leaders can really eradicate many of these kind of factors which really strongly contribute to chronic stress. Another organisational factor is a values mismatch. I think we're seeing that people are increasingly looking for this reflected in their work. So leaders need to really listen to what matters to people, whether it's sustainability, flexibility, helping people in need, or even the understanding that life changes. We have things that come up that we can't anticipate, and having an organisation that allows you to live your life and be your whole self is something that is increasingly in demand. And if people don't see their own values reflected in their work, they can become significantly more susceptible to burnout. So in the report, we actually set out for each of these factors, team and organisational, a set of questions that can be a kind of starting point for leaders to start rethinking and asking some of these questions and evaluating to what extent these factors are active in teams or their organisation. So, how do we end burnout? A lot of leaders push responsibility back onto individuals. Manage your time better, meditate more, be more resilient. And this is really convenient for management because it absolves them of responsibility for the issue, but it doesn't end burnout because it doesn't get to the root of the cause and these structural and cultural issues that we've just looked at. Organisational wellness, those kind of, meditation apps and interventions, these kind of companies, it's an $8 billion annual industry. And yet a 2019 Harvard study found that wellness programs had no impact on overall employee health. So for example, a company gives, a company-wide day off, but everyone returns to that same environment of toxicity or overwork. And another installs, and this actually happened, another installs a volleyball court on the roof, which then goes unused and becomes symbolic of the hypocrisy of senior leaders when it comes to employee mental health. So as we saw last week, some of the respondents to the 2021 Global Burnout Study gave us these answers to these questions. So we gave them a selection of options and then asked, what actions by your organisation, by your manager, and generally would most alleviate your work-related stress. And these were their answers. So the number one was embed wellness as part of the business strategy, review role responsibilities to ensure workload is manageable, increase manager capability to understand burnout and identify stresses. Managers can have a better understanding of their team's workload, push back on unreasonable expectations from stakeholders and clients, champion and role model wellbeing behaviours, and protect those weekends and days off. And generally, number one response was for general actions was the ability to take a mental health day without question, getting more recognition for what they do from leaders, and having the time to learn new skills and capabilities. So people are pretty clear on what they want to see, and it's not, a free lunch or, those kind of once-off initiatives that we sometimes see. Now, we all know, burnout is rife and it is extremely costly to organisations, to society, generally to the individual, of course, too. So why don't we see leadership taking more action? So Dr. Chan and I, again, had a look at this and identified 4 areas that we think potentially contribute. The first is interpersonal risk. So fear of disrupting a leader's relationships with colleagues can be a real factor. Concern about being perceived as aggressive or confrontational. And this image risk is a real concern for many leaders that might prevent them from taking action. Cognitive dissonance, and this is certainly one that I saw at the law firm. Many senior leaders have forged their careers in working environments that traditionally induce burnout. Not only have they survived, they've thrived and risen to the top. And so for these leaders, it can be hard to acknowledge or even entertain the idea that the way they have been working is bad, or accept that they have perhaps paid an unnecessarily high price for their success. The third factor is fear of being blamed. Leaders may be afraid of being held personally responsible if a new anti-burnout initiative fails. So certainly if there's not that sort of safety, psychological safety to take risks and to try new things out. They may worry that they'll be blamed if they aren't able to completely eradicate burnout, and that this might cost them future opportunities. Another very key factor, I think, is institutionalized inaction. Most organisations have thick layers of bureaucracy and processes, certainly larger organisations, and this can be disheartening and intimidating to try to change. So we put it in the too hard basket and nothing ever changes. There's also a tendency to palm burnout off as an HR issue. When burnout impacts the entire organisation, and I really want to underscore this, burnout is not an HR issue. Burnout is an organisational one and a leadership one. So what can leaders do? in order to help leaders sort of, overcome some of these blocks. Dr. Chan and I looked again at the research that's gone before us, the research that we've done ourselves, and the data from our study. We created a framework to create streams of activity across the organisation to empower courageous leadership and to generate momentum to ultimately end burnout. We framed it as RISE. So I'm just going to walk you through briefly what the aspects of RISE entail. And so it's a sort of a macro approach that's particularly targeted at sort of senior leaders to be able to bring to the organisation, but it's also something we feel that managers and leaders at all levels can take from and use as a form of inspiration to start to even create sort of connections throughout an organisation and form that sense of momentum about an anti-burnout shift in culture. So rethink the ways we work. Before I get to that, I do also want to say, I think one of the key points here is that I feel like the effectiveness of RISE, it really hinges on leaders being human leaders, which is why I'm really glad to be speaking to you. You know, they need to understand the issue of burnout, have the language around it, and understand what's at stake for individuals, for teams, for the organisation at large. They need to also be willing to authentically embody the kind of change that they want to see. And this takes courage and vision. It also takes work, not just sort of within the organisation, but work on themselves as well. It's sort of an ongoing development. So I think that's kind of something that's really important to understand, that it's not just creating change within an organisation, but it actually takes leaders stepping up, willing to be vulnerable and willing to learn themselves. So rethink sort of looks at thinking about some of the fundamental assumptions and norms we have about the way we work. And this means sort of really going back to basics in terms of mission, vision, and values, and how these manifest in our day-to-day work. So many of these assumptions and norms are sort of so embedded in our work culture that challenging them can seem like you're trying to debate whether the sky is blue. And yet it's this very fundamental level of questioning that is needed to shift our ways of working. So questions to rethink might include: what bad behaviours and habits are being tolerated? Which inefficient processes have become embedded in organisational culture? What unrealistic and unfair expectations have we normalised? And in the report, we go into some greater detail in terms of these questions that we can ask and a framework for moving forward with Rethink. Another aspect is to inspire. So inspiring people to actively prioritise well-being. Addressing an issue as large and complex as burnout is an unpathed journey. So stimulating the courage and the vision and the confidence in people to join this journey will require people to be really intrinsically motivated to take part. So this is where leaders really need to inspire. They need to authentically believe in this culture shift and inspire others to do the same. And this involves really committing to the purpose and the values that underpin an anti-burnout culture, really working on communication skills, so really focusing on listening, as well as being able to vulnerably articulate their own experience, really radiating authenticity. And I think that's a really important factor for this. It needs to feel, if people are smart, people will sense as soon as something feels like a PR move or something that is, just another form of basically trying to extract more work from us. So it really needs to have that authenticity about it, which also means really involving people at all levels in the conversation around the change that you want to make. And I think what we showed in the data that we derived, that I showed you from people's responses, people have some really intelligent ideas as to what is required. So really reaching out and involving people in that process of iteration. And being approachable and inclusive is really important as well, so that it doesn't feel like this is just a mandate from senior leadership, but something that's actually people can own and take on themselves. Support managers through acknowledgement and education. So the third part of RISE is that we really need more than just good intentions to end burnout. I think that's kind of where we're hitting at the moment. We're seeing a lot of positive intent by leaders, and sort of almost like we know what we want to do, but it really needs to be backed by action and an infrastructure that supports managers so that intent is translated into action, which then translates into lived experience, because I think that's where we see chronic stress arising. It's the day-to-day experiences that we have at work. So without a supportive infrastructure, asking managers to support their people or help people, thrive in the workplace just ends up becoming another task on the list that just slips down and eventually never happens. So I think there are three things that Dr. Chan and I identified in support, and those are educate, so offering training and education in burnout, in well-being, in what it really means, and not just in terms of a free yoga class, but really looking at, the lived and breathed experience of being at work and how we can do that with well-being as a focus. It also obviously involves time and allocating time and resources to managers. So it's not something that's kind of a fluffy cloud that floats by that they don't ever get to, but it's actually something that's really a key part of their day, and that there are also resources allocated so that they can do what they need to support the team and to make sure that people are feeling seen and heard. The final aspect of RISE is to experiment. So experiment with measurable solutions to burnout. A lot of leaders don't actively promote a culture of continual improvement or encourage cognitive diversity, and others talk about it, but they don't actually act on it. They just is focused on, let's just get through this quarter, get through this week, get through this day. So experiment takes a little bit of courage, I think, in the sense that it takes that zooming out that I talked about earlier to be able to see the importance of the longer term picture. Burnout can take years to occur, and so it takes looking at cultural sort of issues from that more macro perspective to see what's causing it, rather than just thinking, well, let's just get through to this next deadline, let's just get through, deliver this to the client and worry about that later. So experimentation can be built into sort of the company culture as well, and this involves shifting to a growth mindset, providing cultural support and resources so there is actually space and time to experiment, and also the space and time to fail, try things out, and if it doesn't work, studying those failures with curiosity rather than blame. So we feel that when we RISE, especially together, if there's multiple leaders across an organisation, we can start to overcome that natural response of fear or overwhelm that might currently prevent leaders from taking action on burnout. There is no one-size-fits-all magic silver bullet to ending burnout. It requires active, curious inquiry, open discussion, and a real openness to positive change at all levels through the organisation. I consider myself an optimistic realist, and I firmly believe that this is possible, and I see it happening slowly but surely, certain clients and in the world more broadly. So I'm hopeful. I just wanted to share with you also a quote from the most preeminent burnout researcher who's been in the field for over 40 years, Dr. Christina Maslach, personal hero. There's this old saying, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. The thrust of our argument is, why don't you change the heat? How about redesigning the kitchen? That's a lot of information. That's sort of the causes and the solutions that Dr. Chan and I identified in the report. I'm really excited to hear if there are questions, feedback. Thank you.
Wow, Sally, firstly, thank you so much. That was a brilliant session. And what I really picked up on, I guess, more than anything, was this sentiment that, it's that intention really behind it. And certainly in my experience, I've worked in a lot of organizations that I believe are trying to address burnout, but perhaps are trying to address burnout for a myriad of different reasons, but primarily the productivity and, the sales figures for their own organizations. And certainly there's a body of research now, or I've heard of the quote being thrown around that, you know, for every dollar in well-being invested equals this return on the business. And I think when we have dialogue around that being the reason we're investing in well-being, potentially is why we're still getting, you know, these outcomes that aren't always what we want, because they're not focused actually on improving the outcomes for the individual. They're focused on improving the outcomes for the business always. And we continue to have that dialogue that is centered around, well, what's the organizational outcome? And, you know, for those of us who have suffered burnout, and as you mentioned, Sally, people are great at understanding, or I call it the bullshit detector. They're very good at understanding when an organization isn't being genuine in their approach. And I think I've been in those organizations where there is lip service paid to certain things. And you can feel when the intention isn't your own well-being and isn't your own capacity to thrive. It's in actual fact, what can you do for us as a result of this program? So I think, as you mentioned, that RISE process right back at that beginning, rethinking why we should be tackling burnout. Is it just so we can make more money? Is it so we can have more productive staff? Or is it because human beings deserve to thrive at work and deserve to feel connected and belonging and not killed by their jobs? So my personal takeaways that I'd like for us to rethink that whole concept of why we're addressing this, why we even go to work in the first place. And this comes back, you know, to the values alignment and all of those sorts of things. So I really appreciate that research, Sally, and that was my kind of key takeaway, is that there's still too much dialogue around the productivity outcomes for why we should be addressing well-being and burnout. But the dialogue shift needs to really be, you know, why does this benefit the individual? So I really appreciate those strategies. And I think it is, I love this idea of it being a trial and error thing as well, and introducing this necessity for that interpersonal risk to be okay, because I think that does prohibit us from trying things, as you mentioned, because we're scared they'll fail, you know. And I certainly know I've worked in organizations in the past where if you bring an idea to the table about, well, let's try it this way, and you then become the champion of that idea, you're sort of benchmarked on the success of that idea as well. And that kind of sets you up as that leader trying to drive that change. It's like, well, I'm really sticking my neck out in this. And that makes it really difficult for leaders, particularly in middle management, to actually want to take things on like this and want to role model that behavior and those sorts of things. So again, Sally, thank you again. I certainly always learn a lot from these sessions, but I really appreciate that.
Thanks so much, Alexis. And I do want to point out, I don't have anything necessarily against, you know, against yoga or free lunches or some snacks in the kitchen, all these kind of things. There's nothing, or you know, a company-wide week off. We saw quite a lot of that in the last year happening, that was, you know, covered in the media. There's nothing ostensibly wrong with those things, but when there's no effort made, when these are kind of Bandaid solutions, when the causes are actually the embedded structures and processes that we have to work with every day. Yeah. So if that's, you know, that doesn't solve the chronic stress basically. And what we need to be looking at is really addressing those more systemic things. And I fully agree. It can be really intimidating to try to change. I think what Dr. Chen and I really were trying to look at as well was ways of helping people, managers, leaders feel less alone. So that they don't feel like they're alone, you know, sort of sticking their neck out, that they can maybe, you know, workshop some ideas together about rethinking, present them, get some feedback, and create a bit of momentum there, and a little bit more, you know, a little bit more of a safe space for people to have a conversation, because I think that is those factors are really true. And as much as it's easy to think, oh, you know, leaders should just get over it and not take those kind of risks, I think we also need to have some compassion for that and for the reasons that they do feel incapable. So thanks for that feedback.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And actually, interestingly, when you're speaking about this idea of like involving people in the process of mitigating burnout. So in my own personal example, I've worked, you know, from corporate marketing to local government to Fairfax in Australia. So a real variation of kind of different size companies and things like that. And one thing that I always found interesting in every single company almost that I've worked for, even the really good companies that I've worked for, is that there seems to be little to no involvement in actually asking employees what they want or how what they value in terms of managing their own well-being. So I've seen programs from, free gym memberships, EAP access, they're pretty standard in a lot of companies these days. But I mean, even down to one company I worked at thought that, Friday 4:30 knockoff and free beers was like a way to, deal with this and deal with culture. And I think we almost like reinforce people's need to conform to our idea of what it should look like when we're enforcing things like that. So I think greater dialogue from an employee level, what's important to you? What does well-being look like for you? What do you need is really, really critical as well. And, using your logo there with the battery, it's almost like when you just allow employees their weekend or think that just giving them a yoga session or whatever the case is, it's kind of like taking your iPhone on dead flat, charging it for 2 minutes, taking it back off and then hoping it runs for another week and then just doing that once a week. It's nonsensical. But that's often what we see in organizations. Let's smash people till Friday, give them a free beer, let them go home and take 2 days just to recover and deal with kids and everything else. And then we'll get them back in on Monday and do the same again and hope that that's been enough to recover, or, give people a week off to go to Bali and these kinds of things and hope that they'll come back recovered. But systemically, when we just burn people day in, day out, we're not allowing that battery to fully recharge, which is what it sounds like you're saying to a larger extent there.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that kind of came to light to me in some research that I was doing last year, where it really sort of hit home. Wow, we have this kind of structure at the moment where there's a really, it's very normalized for work to drain us. And then with the expectation that we spend our evening, our non-work time, evenings or weekends or vacations, recharging and getting ready to go back into battle, as it were. And I think that is also a really, that's also a massive contributor to burnout, because it ends up meaning there is no space for work to be a space for creativity, for relaxed thinking, for maybe a different kind of activity. So I think that variety, and that's where job design is also very important, to make sure that people aren't just being sort of like going from one deadline straight into the next. And as a lawyer, that was certainly my experience. You had a series of very big deadlines as what one would pass, and it was like, when you're surfing and your big wave's just gone and you have another huge wave crashing, you have no time to take a breath and become centered. So I think that's something that organizations can look to as well, that it's ultimately, and again, it's actually in their financial interest to do this, but to give people a job design that is sustainable and also offers that capacity for the battery to be recharged on work hours.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And with that as well, what I'm hearing you say is that essentially we're expecting people to recover just so they can come back to work. So we're basically putting work at the center of their universe, which we know increasingly is not okay. And especially now as we see millennials, Gen Z, and younger moving into roles, and particularly moving forward into leadership roles, there's going to be so much pushback around that, because people aren't okay with the center of the universe being their job. So I think there's so many reasons right now as to why organizations need to be addressing this. Obviously the well-being of their employees, but I believe it's also the mindset from younger generations is that work as the center of the universe is actually unacceptable.
Totally. That's antiquated, I think, for the younger generation. That really fills me with hope to a certain extent as well, that there's some boundary setting going on by the younger generation, saying that that's not going to be okay. And if you want to attract and retain those talent, you're going to have to shift and meet their needs and their, the values that they're seeking from their workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sally, we have a few questions coming in here. We've had one come through from Beverly, and I think we did cover this as part of last week's session, but I'll ask it just to recap. And that is, do we have an answer if the pandemic increased burnout? Is there sort of any research or studies around that?
So, yeah, we did have actually. So it's a year, 2021 was a year-on-year study to the 2020 study that Dr. Chan did independently. And we saw about a 5% increase year on year. And as I spoke to you last week, I think to my mind that there's partly in sort of an ongoing trend of burnout increasing, and partly exacerbated by the pandemic. I think most of the discussion amongst burnout researchers at the moment is that there's kind of a leveling impact of the pandemic for a lot of people who made the shift to work from home. You know, for some people that actually had a positive impact on their experience of work for a number of reasons I won't go into detail here, but for others it didn't. So I think that actually kind of, most of us sort of agreed that probably reasonably, you know, pretty much leveled out. But I would say the general uncertainty of the pandemic, that experience would have impacted, and that would have contributed to that 5% rise that we saw year on year.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sally. And we're getting some great questions coming through. I'm just going to take the time to read some out. Sandra suggested that RISE is a great approach to engage with leaders in a proactive and collegiate way that isn't about blaming and shaming. And I think that's a great point, Sandra, because it comes back to Sally's idea that interpersonal risk, which I mean is a component of psychological safety, that ability to take risk, and one of the other components of psychological safety is the ability to challenge status quo. So I think if we have a culture around blaming and shaming, and again, I can speak back to my corporate marketing days. I remember being told, oh, if you need to take a morning off and work from home, feel free to do it. But then if I showed up at 11 a.m., people would be, oh, where have you been this morning? And I was like, well, am I actually allowed to take a morning off to work from home? Or is this just another weapon against, you know, being the first one in and the last to leave sort of vibe? So I think there's that idea of rethinking, you know, is the culture that we say we're trying to promote actually the culture that we're promoting? Is that in alignment with how we're actually behaving?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point that you're making, Alexis, because it's really that and that really speaks to my experience, honestly, in the law firm as well. It's that kind of, you know, that hypocrisy, that, you know, saying one thing, having a policy that says one thing, but then being treated a particular way and almost, you know, shamed for acting on that policy is really going to disincentivize people from doing that kind of thing. So there's that, yeah, if you're going to have a policy, then that really needs to be something where in the culture, that's how we do things. Senior leaders do it you know, and even if it is something that not everyone does, it's certainly not something that is then sort of pointed out as a point of differentiation or, you know, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And that's something I see so common in my work is a gap between our behaviors and the systems in place. Typically, I see people wanting to make the change and trying to be the change, but there's that systemic gap. You know, the job fit or the job structure, job content doesn't allow for that. And certainly I know in your experience as being a lawyer, you know, when we see the highest attrition rates of almost any industry right now with young lawyers, the first 5 years once they're working in law, they're leaving again because there's this, like, the content of the job is just so intense, and you know, their organizations might be telling them manage your stress or trying to give them well-being opportunities, but when the structure doesn't align as well, it's counterintuitive to that.
Yeah, I'll save my full anti-law firm rant, you know, pyramid scheme kind of rant for another time. It's definitely one. It's really upsetting in a lot of ways to see, because there are lots of law graduates who have, you know, really high hopes, and they get into the law firm environment. They know that it's going to be hard, and they really sacrifice themselves. And you see lawyers for most of their 20s barely see the light of day, because they're trying to meet that need. And ultimately it is quite a pyramid type scheme, and they kind of, I think in some ways, rely on that certain level of burnout to just sort of weed out the people who aren't willing to just really decimate the rest of their lives in order to reach partner level. So it's certainly one thing I'm really great. You know, I think in other fields and in other industries, you know, we highlight in the report also the example of Atlassian, which is an amazing Australian company, which is really, really demonstrated, I think, almost like a great textbook example of how to create a healthy company culture that is genuinely, in the lived day-to-day experience for employees, a safe place to be, a safe place to bring your full self to, you know, that kind of thing that you mentioned, where you kind of get, you know, looked at weirdly for coming in at 11 when that was completely within your right to do. That sort of thing just doesn't happen. And so I think there are, we are starting to see examples like that. It will potentially be easier for a younger company to sort of, imbue those the culture with well-being than it is for perhaps a longer existing company to transform it. That doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think certainly with the RISE model, that's what that was our focus, just to empower leaders at existing large companies to start to make those changes.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Sally. And that's obviously, Dermot's written here, it's the cultural rules of engagement. And that obviously is a lot harder to overhaul down the track, but certainly possible with the right mindset around it as well. So I'm going to keep moving through some questions. Deborah's actually asked a question with relation to the pandemic. And that is, obviously we have been more fragile throughout the pandemic. Did the data show that the process of reaching burnout was shorter within that year based on previous years studied at all? Like, were we hitting burnout quicker than ever before within the pandemic, or was there no real shift in that, that period of reaching that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We didn't actually, because our data was derived from surveys and not with individual interviews, we weren't actually able to talk to people about their own timeline. So we weren't able to identify the sort of the length of time which someone had been moving into the spectrum of burnout and ultimately hitting it. What we did see is that each of the dimensions of burnout year on year were higher. So that means that not only were more people were burnt out, but people are more burnt out year on year. So there was that uptick. What I would suspect, based on my own research and understanding, is that I think for a lot of us, the pandemic probably created a low level amount of chronic stress, uncertainty, and that's a little bit of being on alert, that the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. There's something big is happening, I need to be on guard. I think a lot of us have experienced that. So if that perhaps acts as an extra layer, and on top of which you have the chronic stress from the workplace, then I think that would certainly exacerbate and potentially speed up burnout too. But unfortunately, I don't have the hard numbers to back that, but that would certainly be my idea on that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sally. That's great. Now, Ricardo's asked a question around the evolution of accountability, and he's asked one with a little more depth. So I'm going to give you his second one. And that is, are we seeing a growth in holding C-suite executives accountable for employee well-being? And he's gone on to say, I imagine there are early adopter companies out there. Is there a way, can this network highlight them? So I guess there's two parts to that question. So perhaps we'll start with the first part, Sally. Are you seeing a shift in accountability sort of at a C-suite level with that?
A little bit, very minor. There's been a couple of reports of incidences where employees have actually taken legal action against management for mental health issues that have arisen as a result of the workplace. So there was a law firm in the UK, and I believe a corporation in the United States where this occurred, and also an incident in Australia, I believe, recently too. So, I mean, in terms of that sort of sense of accountability, that's certainly occurring. I think I honestly, I don't know. I don't feel like confident to sort of speculate generally about whether C-suite executives are being held more accountable. What I am seeing is generally that there was even an article in the New York Times yesterday, which I just shared on LinkedIn, in which Dr. Christina Maslach was interviewed, and it sort of outlined how burnout is not an individual issue, it is an organizational cultural. So I feel like there is this increasing awareness that it is it is on leaders really, and senior leadership particularly, to take responsibility. I think for me, burnout's not our fault. Recovery is our responsibility. When it gets to that stage, you can't be looking to the company to help you recover. But we really do need to be, holding C-suite executives more accountable. Yeah, so I'm sorry I can't give you a sort of really a clear answer on that. But I think there is a problem. I would suspect in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll certainly see a real growth in kind of the spotlight being held on C-suite executives and senior leaders to be showing the actions that they're actually taking, rather than just paying lip service to burnout and well-being.
Yeah, and I think I love that, Sally, and I think it's a really difficult question to answer as well, because the problem when it comes to C-suite executives is, who are they being held accountable to? And, you know, they have stakeholders who hold them accountable to, you know, revenue outcomes and things like that. And that's where it becomes a big discrepancy, because it almost is the way in which we measure some of those things, the way in which we measure like productivity and things like that, are very revenue profit based. And I think that there, again, needs to be a shift in the dialogue around why we're holding them accountable and to what. And I know in certain countries, Nordic countries, I think it was Finland just this week, passed legislation around a 4-day work week and other contact rules. So non-contact rules outside of the workplaces and things like that. And, you know, it would be my hope that in certain countries we can even advocate and push for more of that, because I think there will always be an issue with holding C-suite levels accountable for things like well-being and burnout when they are also being held accountable by stakeholders for revenue, profit, etc. So I think there's always going to be this struggle between the two. But I think that's where, you know, we have capacity as movements, as advocates in this space, as governments, to also step in and say, no, well, you know, there needs to be a certain level of legislation around this. And I think actually Canada, I know we have some Canadians on the call, I think there was legislation passed there in the last year around what psychological safety meant within organizations and things like that as well, which is also brilliant to hear.
I completely agree with you, Alexis. This is actually a real passion of mine. I think partly as a former lawyer, I really see that, and also my experience and research into the situation in different countries and the impact that legislation can have. I think, and I talked to Dr. Michael Leiter about this point specifically, who's another leading researcher, and he said, you know, absolutely. He gave the example of the Discrimination Act in the United States, which was brought in 30 years ago and meant that or Disability Act, I think, sorry. So people with disabilities would be basically allowed, you know, the rules were brought into place so that they could be treated equally in the job application process, and that measures would be taken so that people with disabilities could enter the workforce in the same way that everyone else can. And he gave that as an example of, like, that's where, you know, we really do need governments, I think, to some extent. And I certainly, like, my goal is within 10 years to be putting a lot of pressure at EU level to see that kind of regulation and legislation be in place to counterbalance what happens when, you know, the kind of out of control, I think, you know, kind of sort of situation that we have at the moment, which is where it's all about money and it's all about shareholders having, you know, complete control over strategy and business decisions to some extent. So I really do believe that there's a big, like, you're right, Belgium has just brought in the legislation. Portugal has actually made it, brought in legislation so that you can't be contacted by text or by email by your employer outside of working hours. These things might seem to some people, you know, it might seem arbitrary, but I really do believe in the power of those rules also changing our mindset a little bit, to the point where in 20 years that's normalized instead of overwork.
I totally agree, Sally. And I think it's that comment around, like, these things might feel arbitrary now, but we need a starting point to build on some of these things. So I certainly think that they're huge wins for those of us, you know, in this space, wanting to see true difference in that, and acknowledgement from governments as well. So I think it's great, because they're putting the onus back on the company then, or mandating it. So I think it's fantastic. Now, we do have some more questions. Catherine, I guess, has asked a question that is sort of on topic with what we've just been discussing. And that is, in a company where burnout is a rampant reality, how can you change the environment when the cause of the burnout is likely coming from the top? So do you think there could or should be responsibility of the board to address?
Yes. I mean, the short answer, yes. I mean, in an ideal world, that would be something where board members, I think, have almost the morality to want to treat people as humans, and to take these kind of steps to redress, you know, toxic cultures in the workplace, to ensure that people are actually in a situation where they can live a healthy, happy, sustainable life and work at the company. I think there's some debate a little bit around, in order not to completely disempower us who aren't at the C-suite level, I think there's also some empowerment that we can take on and say, look, what's my sphere of influence? How can I impact where the people I'm immediately working with? However, I do think that to see the at least a quicker shift and perhaps a more holistic organizational wide shift, that at board level, that's where real impact can happen. So that's ideally where RISE would be implemented and sort of started out within an organization.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sally. And it is, it's a common frustration I see in this line of work, is I do tend to have a lot of middle managers, joining our sessions and things like that as well. And they feel this frustration of wanting to do better for themselves and for their team, but having, having that discrepancy between what they're allowed to do and what their capacity for change is, and that higher level kind of being prohibitive of that. So I'm really glad we touched on that. So thank you for that. Beverly's also asked, is it reasonable for a company to expect full capacity 24/7? Is it not better to allocate work at 60% capacity and allow time to recuperate? Now, I do think we touched on this briefly last week, but I'll let you run with that one, Sally.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's one where we see, that expectation that people are constantly available directly contributes to that heightened sense of alertness that I spoke to and explained in some more detail last week. So when we're in chronic stress and we have this, sympathetic nervous system engaged, we're in that state of alertness. That kind of idea that we should constantly be checking our phones, that we can be constantly emailed, that there can be a call coming in and leave your ringer on and take your computer with you on vacation, is detrimental to our mental, physical, physiological, emotional, spiritual health. So absolutely, and the research shows that when you actually limit the amount of hours that people work, there's a huge body of work around the 4-day week, which I'm a proponent of. I think there's we can really see how when you actually limit that and you make time off actually time off, that's when the parasympathetic nervous system can kick back in. That's when people can rest and recuperate. And I think allocating work in a 60% capacity is absolutely, that could be part of job design as well, to be like, let's underestimate, let's make sure that people do have space for the unexpected to come up, for the stuff that might shift from week to week, and to really be generous to people in that, rather than simply, particularly with high achievers, dumping it all on them and seeing how they cope.
Yeah, I think that's great insight, Sally. And I think there's much to be learnt here around the neuroscience within that question as well. And I know you've mentioned just then and also last week this idea of sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, and that is, bringing yourself back into a state of rest and digest, so to speak, and bringing yourself out of that cortisol kind of area. But something else that is really important with that, and when we talk about productivity and when we talk about the neuroscience of different brain waves, we actually know our brain has to have different types of brain waves to be functioning at different levels. Like there's this executive cognitive function level, but for things like creativity, for things like rest, they're actually different brain states entirely. And I think that there is still much to be learned around the neuroscience for leaders to understand that if you want to drive your employees to a constant cortisol adrenaline state, their brain's only functioning in a certain kind of capacity, which means if you're demanding collaboration, creativity, all these beautiful things that come from different brain states, you're actually prohibiting them from doing that by the surroundings that they're in. So I think, as you mentioned, like there's the nervous system states, and Beverly's mentioned down further as well that she's having clients that are actually exhibiting physiological symptoms as a result of burnout. And we know that this is absolutely can be the case when we do not pay attention to what's happening inside us for a prolonged period of time. And that chronic stress obviously is what results in burnout. We very much will have physical symptoms as a result. And I think for a lot of leaders, there's a lot of capacity to learn more, firstly about that, but also around the brain states required for some of the different outcomes that we actually need in our businesses as well. Again, that creativity, executive function and things like that. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and to that point, yeah, I fully agree, and I think that's something that it's really important for people to have an understanding. Also, just how debilitating the impact of burnout is on our brains and on our bodies, and how it can be almost, it's truly incredible to me to see how some high performers are simply able to just keep going and going when they are, really in states of quite, really quite compromised physically, physiologically. Now, I have, in my sort of darker moments, I sometimes think there are probably certain companies where that's almost what they want to create, in the sense that if you want drone workers who won't push back and who are, sort of in a constant state of just trying to survive, then burnout's kind of ideal. But in any kind of healthy, modern, genuinely humane workplace, then obviously there's no place for that whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. And it comes back to understanding like what our employees' job content is and how we can actually empower them to perform that in the best way possible. And I read a horrific article not too long ago, and I don't know how much merit or data there is to back this, but it was around Amazon. Now, we all know Amazon's fairly questionable in terms of employee practices. And I read somewhere that their turnover rate was something like 300% annually, and that they would actually run out of workers within the US within a certain period of time, on some of their factory floors and things like that. And then I read quotes from Jeff Bezos himself saying that they actually want turnover in their particular organization because it saves them from having to deal with all this crap, so to speak, down the track. They actually want to get people in, smash them, get them out again, get new ones in, and not have what he calls as a stagnant culture. And I listened to this and I was mortified for obvious reasons, but also I think it comes back to that conversation we had earlier around like the societal, like who are we glorifying in business culture sometimes, and this hustle culture. And I mean that is for me just frankly horrific. But that really, when we glorify people like this in public discourse, it's just reinforcing this message that you will be commoditized in your workforce because certain folk get to capitalize off that, and they're the kind of people we all aspire to be, and therefore we must buy into this really sort of awful hustle culture as well.
Yeah, no, it's something I speak to that in my last book. I sort of spend a sort of chapter really delving into that kind of more broad external work culture that you were speaking to, and it is one of the metaphors that I quite like is, it's almost like we're pens. It's really treating humans as human capital, which is a term I detest, because it means we're taking a human as if they were a pen, using up the ink and then throwing them away and getting a new pen, and really treating humans in that dehumanized way. And yet you're right, in sort of, there's in a lot of cultural areas, there is still a lot of veneration for that kind of person who gets away with that and who becomes very rich because of that. I'd like to think also, as we spoke to earlier, that the younger generations, that there might be a shift there as well in terms of values, in terms of role models, and in terms of how they actually want to live their daily life, and rather than it being, I want to be successful when I'm 50, 60s, retire wealthy. How do I want to spend my day right now, and in what company? And so having that more mindful approach, I think, to designing work environments and job design as well. Hopefully that shift is, I honestly think it's already happening.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there, Sally. So let's hope that it's sooner rather than later. And having fantastic leaders on the call like this, hopefully, is just one step in helping us get some of this information and incredible research where it's needed most. So with that said, guys, I am going to wrap up today's session. It's been a pleasure, as always, to host you all this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're joining us in the world. I do hope that you have gained some valuable insights from today's session. So just in summary, today's session was around the causes of burnout and some of the preventative measures that we need to be taking. As Sally has mentioned today, there's some very clear team and manager factors at play here, and also some organizational factors at play. Within their Global Workplace Burnout Study 2021, they've highlighted some fantastic questions that you can start asking in your organization to start using this RISE process. Let's have this conversation. Let's start rethinking what we have in place and our behavior and the systems and the job designs that we have in place in our organization are directly leading to burnout. The onus is on us as leaders, as organizations, to step up to the plate here. It's not something we should be shying away from. It's something that we feel we should be empowered by. This gives us the power. If we know that the onus is on leaders and is on organizations, this is a wonderful opportunity to start putting some of this research into place and start asking the right questions to actually start driving change. This is going to be key in things like employee retention, and some of these issues that we've mentioned, do relate to a company's triple bottom line. But more than anything else, it's going to create happy and healthy organizations where human beings can actually show up and thrive and feel meaning and connection and feel healthy and safe at work. And that's the sort of world that I would like to live in. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been a fantastic session, and thank you so much to Sally Clarke and Dr. John Chen for their wonderful research. We look forward to seeing your research again in future years and learning more from you. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Alexis. Thanks everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure.
Alrighty, guys.